Last year, in spite of COVID, we ran family camps all summer long, had 5 families at a time, and then 1 family at a time at our wilderness site. We canceled all of our regular programming, but we were able to have 5 families. And it was just so neat to see families like one at a time at our different activities because of the distancing and all that. Seeing a family ride horseback across our field and go off for a ride, or knowing that they were watching them going off on their vehicle to go canoeing and hiking and all of that stuff, and being able to sit around the fire and to be together. And we're doing the same thing this year. We as a board decided way back in February that we would just, because it was so uncertain, we wanted to be sure. And I know we haven't had to scramble, I guess, let's put it that way. We've known what we were going to do. And so again, we canceled all of our programs at our residence site and just are doing families. We upped it to 7 families this summer a week. And we started last Thursday, and things are just going really, really well. Last year as well, with all the financial aspect of COVID and all that, Blue Brown actually finished the summer with all of our bills paid, and the end of the year with all of our bills paid. And because of God's faithfulness and His people, we ended up with an unbelievable amount of money in the bank. It was actually staggering to see what the camp's bank account was like at the end of the year. And it's been really, really neat, and people have just stepped forward. And I'm a man of little faith. We had a school group that was supposed to come in from Calgary, and they canceled, and that was $5,000 worth of money. And they had to cancel, and I thought, okay, Lord, where am I going to get that $5,000 from, right? How am I going to make up that $5,000? Yeah, right. And so there's a foundation that has donated the last 2 years $15,000, which is really neat. And so I wrote them a letter in the spring and seeing if they'd be interested in helping out and have that ability to be, again, because of COVID and stuff. And so I got an email 2 days later, and the lady said, "Brent, we got your letter, but I want you to know we already wrote the check," which was really neat that they wrote the check well before I even asked, and just to have a foundation committed to us. But it's normally $15,000. Guess how much the check was for? 20, exactly. Thanks, Lord. So just, neat stuff like that. And the other neat thing is 2 years ago when I came, we got 3 Canada Summer Jobs grants. Last year we got 9. This year we got 25. So every one of my staff, even my high school students, are receiving a grant. So none of the money that's coming in from donations or the families coming in is going to pay staff, which is really neat. That's going to help us hugely in finishing the year again well. But it's just neat to see as well through God's people and God providing. So it's been great. So we're open again. We have families all through from the 17th of June right through the end of August at our residence site. We normally run some partial family camps at our wilderness site, like mother-daughter horse camp and father-daughter horse camp, and a fly fishing and a quad camp and a couple others. Those are all running at our wilderness site, at our residence site. And the one that also really excites me is we have started a very intentional training and discipleship program for high school students. So 15 and 16-year-olds. So I have 18 of them over the summer coming to a third site and spending time for 3 weeks getting trained, getting more discipleship, going on a backpacking trip, that kind of thing. So really exciting. In 2019, I had 7 junior staff. This year I have 30. And so it's just neat to see that building, and so it helps us run camp, but also of course, the main thing is the discipleship, but of course, as well, the long term is staffing. So pretty excited about that. So Blue Brana's doing well. We got a great board, great supporters, and just a great God, and really neat seeing things progressing. So, and ma'am, thanks for the water. I was wondering where I would really get some from, so thanks. So yeah, this morning's message is on grace, and I was asking the Lord as I came here for a really good illustration, and I left at 10 to 8. It normally takes me just a little bit over 2 hours to get here. I thought, I'm going to get here at 10, I got lots of time, but construction on 22 is just nasty. I know, it's Sunday, they won't be, well, that was a mistake, so anyway. So I walked in here at 10:33, and so yeah, grace, thanks, that's good. Well, yeah, grace or disgrace, that is our topic for the day. But let's pray together. Father, thanks for, that we get to be together. It's neat, it's great to get together as your people, as family, and come and fellowship together and to learn from your word. And so we ask your blessing today as we look into it. Father, there's a lot of things that make us bow our heads and our feet kind of trudge along because of things we've done in the past. And we need to know that we don't live in disgrace, we live in grace. Thank you for that. Press that on our hearts today in Jesus' name. Amen. So I'd like you to take you on a trip down memory lane. Do you remember your first car? Mine was a 1964 Pontiac Laurentian. This is a boat. Most little cars these days could fit in the trunk of that car. It was pink and brown, supposed to have been red, but with the fading and the rust, that was the color. Had about 20 things wrong with it, but it just kept on going. You could climb into the engine. Now you gotta stick your tongue out the right way just to get to a part, right? Well, there it was all, it was all right there. Do you remember your first date? Those of you that are married. Mine, I don't know why I did this. I double dated with my sister and brother-in-law. Like, what was I thinking? It worked out fine. Your first kiss? Mosquito-infested bog. That's where mine was. It was very quick. Let's get out of here. Do you remember your first tractor? Those of you that are farmers, do you remember the first time you drove your first tractor? Do you remember just the excitement of these kind of events, the memories that they bring? Do you remember if you play ball, hockey, do you remember your first goal that you ever scored, your first basketball hoop? Do you remember your first job? It dates me. I got paid $2.20 an hour. That was my first job. Yeah, some of you are going, that was a lot of money. I only got paid $1. Okay, there you go. Do you remember your first child, your first grandchild, your first boat, your graduation? My youngest daughter graduates on Tuesday, and then she leaves for Camp Nakamin for the summer to be counselor there, and then to Trinity Western. So we are now almost officially empty nesters. Didn't think I was that old, but anyway. So we have memories. We have good ones. We have fun ones. We have things that make us laugh, bring a smile, take us to a far-off place that was just so good. It's just a great memory. I have a friend of mine. His name is Pete. He spent a number of years at Blue Brana. And the day that I put my resume in for the position of director, Pete was at our place. It was my birthday. And you mentioned Blue Brana, the mustard seed, and horseback trips to Pete, and he'll talk all afternoon. And that's basically what he did, which is fine. And but yeah, we have all these great memories. We have things that take us back to a great place. But we have other ones as well, other memories that we would like to forget, ones that invoke shame, regret, remorse, a word, a slap, an action, something you did, something you wish you had done, a failure, a habit that you can't break, courage that you couldn't find, a memory that you would like to just reach out and grab back, a broken promise, wasted years, poor choices. Maybe this, I don't expect this is you, but it's a neat story. You run your finger over the photo of her face. She was only 5 years old when you took it. Cheeks freckled by the summer sun, her hair in pigtails and her feet in flippers. That was 20 years ago. You're 3 marriages ago, 1,000,000 miles and emails ago. Tonight she walks down the aisle on the arm of another father, and you left your family bobbing in the wake of your high-speed career. And now that you have what you want, you don't want it at all, and you wish for a second chance. There's times when that story's not me, but I know that the idea is me. I look back and I wish I had second chances with my kids. We had Psalm 51 read, and David was, at that point, he wished for a second chance, as we see in Psalm 51. David says, my sin is ever before me. I like the version that was read. It says, my sin haunts me. His sin was right here. Wherever he would go out onto the balcony where he would have looked down at where Bathsheba was, and that memory comes back. He goes to the cemetery, to the grave of the baby that was born of that union that passed away, and that memory is right there. He looks at Bathsheba and thinks of that situation and what a mistake. That was awful. And then he says a phrase that we often say, how could I ever do that? How could I ever have done that? Why didn't I do what I should have done? Ever say that? 2 Samuel gives us the story of David and Bathsheba, 2 Samuel 11, 1-5. And listen to what David, he wished that he had done what he should have done. 2 Samuel 11, 1-5. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, it's a critical statement, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. So the time of year when the kings go off to war, David should have been there, but instead he stayed in Jerusalem. And then one evening he got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. David should have been where he should have been. And we find in Psalm 51, after Nathan had come to him and said, you are that man, in regards to the lamb and the neighbor. So we look through Psalm 51, and David says, I'm dirty, I'm filthy, wash me, cleanse me, purge me. My sin is always before me. It's like David's just trying to scrape off that sin, that filth that he feels, that memory. He says, restore to me, create in me, do not cast me away. So the question is, what is God's response to our failure? What is God's response to our mistakes, to our days of reliving the past or wishing that we could just change it? God's answer to the mess of our lives is grace. So what is grace? What does grace look like in your life? What does grace look like in the lives of people you know? What are the stories in people's lives that you know where God has come in and shown grace? How does grace work out from our lives? How do we demonstrate grace to other people? We're all very familiar with the definition of grace, undeserved favor, giving kindness to somebody else, God giving us something that we don't deserve. The Hebrew word grace has actually two words in it, and one of them means, the root word of it means to pitch a tent, to camp. See, the Israelites, when they were traveling as nomads, they would pitch their tents in a circle, and that circle created a protective barrier for them against marauders and thieves. Our sort of familiar phrase would be circle the wagons. Forming that protective barrier. Alongside of the word grace comes words that mean healing, being lifted up, finding refuge, strength, salvation, finding rescue. And grace engulfs all of these ideas. So the idea of grace in our lives, when we have done something that is just this major mistake, this sin that is ever before us, God pitches a tent. He forms a barrier that circle the wagons around us so that we can be protected from our own thoughts of, boy, you're such an idiot. Why did you ever do that? Thoughts from other people that say, you are such a jerk. And of course, thoughts that come in our minds from Satan that says, you do not belong to God and he has absolutely no use for you. So God performs, he pitches that tent, he camps around us and provides that protective barrier. That is grace, rather than God turning his back and wanting nothing to do with us. So I want to look at a couple stories. First one is Moses. We have part A and part B with Moses' life. Part A is 40 years, and then part B is also 40 years, and we have a transition in between there. The first 40 years is Moses' life is remarkable. He has a top-notch resume. He is the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. He is raised in elegance. He is experienced as a warrior. He is educated by the best tutors, capable as a speaker, respected and confident, had a polished chariot, servants at the snap of a finger, the epitome of nobility. Moses was the pride of ancient Egypt. That's his first 40 years. And then we have a transition time. He's spoken to by God. He's told to deliver the Hebrews from bondage. He was determined to obey, but one day he came across an Egyptian that was assaulting a Hebrew, and he took things into his own hands. It was by his might and his power, and not by God's way or God's timing. So the first 40 years is remarkable. Then there's the transition. And now we have the next 40 years. Pharaoh has no more use for Moses. He is instantly humiliated. He runs for his life. His guilt must have been unbelievable. He went from being asked by God to deliver the Israelites, and his whole life went down the tubes after that. It's like building and building, and shortly after you reach the pinnacle of success, you do something stupid financially or morally, and it destroys your family, your reputation, your business, everything. And that's where Moses was at. So he escapes to the Midian desert, and for the next 40 years, God is silent. He's in the desert with a flock of sheep. And what does Moses believe to be true of himself? What does he think? What does he feel about himself? What does he believe to be true? That I'm disqualified? That it's all over? There's guilt, there's remorse. God hasn't spoken to me in 40 years, and he never will again. It's over. Can you imagine being second in line to the greatest nation on earth to talk about downward mobility? But one morning, Moses awakens and he leads his flock of sheep to the backside of the desert, and he's probably done that 100 times already. But today's going to be different. Today the silence would be broken. If you have your Bibles, turn to Exodus chapter 3. going to read parts of that story. Exodus chapter 3, starting at verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Moses. Moses. He knew that voice. He remembered that voice from 40 years ago. Verse 6 says that he was afraid to look at God, and so he hid his face. I get the idea that most of it was probably the fact that it was God, and he didn't want to look at him. But I wonder if part of that afraid to look at his face was what happened 40 years ago. And now God has come to pay back. Now God has come to get me. Now God has come to just do that, right? And so I wonder if he's afraid of that. Thought his life was finished. He made such a mess of things. He'd been convinced that he would never hear that voice again. In verse 11, as we go through the conversation, but Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? You ever done something and then said, Who am I? Who am I to teach Sunday school? Who am I to be on the board? Who am I to get involved in this? Look what happened here. Who am I to do this? Who am I to have this blessing because of what I've done? This thing I've done is here, right in front of my face, and that I allow that to define who I am and define what I can do and define how God is going to use me. And how wrong Moses was. Moses. Do you know what was in that voice? It's grace. Moses thought he was finished forever. Moses was finished as far as his mind was concerned, but not in God's. Moses didn't jump. We see that Moses didn't jump at the chance to lead the Israelites. Chapter 3 and 4 is a dialogue between Moses and God, and God says, go, and Moses says no. But the neat thing is that God invites Moses. I will send you to Pharaoh so that you may bring my people out of Egypt. 4 decades previous, back in Egypt, he'd heard that same statement. Exactly the same statement. And now 40 years later, God is saying the same thing. God is giving him a second chance. But it can't be. No way would God give me a second chance. Verse 12 is really neat. It says, and God says, I will be with you. God doesn't say, I'm going to go with you halfway. Doesn't say, no, I'm going to send you. He doesn't say, I'm going to send somebody else because of. He says, I'm going to send you and I'm going to be with you. Why didn't Moses accept God's grace? Why don't we? I think it's because often our shame screams so loudly and our guilt is so huge. Because the last person on earth that we want to forgive or are willing to forgive is ourselves. The solution? Be reminded of the truth that God in his mercy has chosen to give great grace in spite of and in greater measure than our guilt and shame. I'll say that again. Be reminded of the truth that God in his mercy has chosen to give great grace in spite of and in greater measure than our guilt and shame. Our second story is Samson. Samson was a victim of his lust, becomes a prisoner of his hated enemies, brutally blinded, living in a dungeon, forced to labor as a grinder. From the judge and deliverer of Israel to a grinder. I like one of the versions that says a performer, a clown, somebody to laugh at. What would I say? Guilty. Let him live there in a dungeon for the rest of his life. He deserves it. He got what was due him. But God never runs out of grace. Judges 16 is where we're at, verse 23 to 27. Judges chapter 16, verses 23 to 27. Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god and to celebrate, saying, Our God has delivered Samson our enemy into our hands. When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain. While they were in high spirits, they shouted, Bring out Samson to entertain us. Entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them. Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. And I love what follows. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, O sovereign Lord, remember me. I wonder if between verse 27 and 28, when he said, O sovereign Lord, remember me, I wonder if he just reached up a little bit, kind of felt a little bit of stubble there, doubted, but said, you know what, I wonder. And then he prays. Here's a man who certainly does not deserve the attention of God, a man who forfeited all his rights to pray to God. He didn't deserve new strength. He was a failure, a man with a bad record, a first-round draft pick turned total bust. Yet God answers his prayer. God gives grace. There's lots of verses in the Bible that talk of God's grace. Galatians chapter 2, verse 20 says that Christ lives in me. That's a neat statement. Because we know in the Bible that it talks about the fact that Christ is for me, he is with me, he's ahead of me, he's beside me, that I am with Christ. But it says that Christ is in me. That's grace. 1 John 3, 19 to 20 says, We will be confident when we stand before the Lord, even if our hearts condemn us. We set our hearts at rest in his presence. Even when your heart condemns you because of that, we can set our hearts at rest in his presence. For God is greater than our hearts, and he knows everything. John chapter 8 is one of my favorite stories, the woman caught in adultery. And at the end of the story, Jesus says, Where are all of your accusers? Didn't one of them accuse you? And she says, No, Lord. And then he says, Neither do I. Go and sin no more. Do Do you remember the good old days when credit cards were imprinted by hand? The clerk would take your plastic and put it in this little machine, and then rack. The number would be registered and the purchase would be made. I learned to operate one at a gas station in 1980. Nothing like the surge of power when you run the imprinter over the plastic. Nowadays, there's tap, insert, no noise, no drama, no pain. Bring rack back for everybody to hear. You buy gas, rack. Pay for dinner, rack. You charge some clothes, rack. And if the noise didn't get you, the bill at the end of the month would. 30 days is ample time to rack up enough to rack up your budget. And a lifetime is enough to rack up some major debt in heaven. You yell at your kids, rack. I slapped my daughter once. Rack. You covet a friend's car, rack. You break a promise, rack. You lie, rack. You doze off listening to this sermon, rack. Further and further into debt. Failure, wasted years, regret. Moses and Samson give us tremendous lessons about what a wonderful God we serve. There's a great hymn that says, grace, God's grace. Grace that is greater than all our sin. So this morning I invite you to allow grace to change you, to shape you, to strengthen you. Allow grace to soften you, to shake you. Allow grace to let you rest. So you know that when you fail, that God gives grace. He pitches a tent. He circles the wagons. He builds a wall of healing, a wall of refuge, a wall of strength, a wall of rescue, and He lifts you up. And He says, go and do the same. Put up a tent. Build a wall for somebody. Offer them grace. Great grace. Grace that you have received. I think we have one more song. Is that correct? Thanks.
Our last song is one that we will be doing next week as well. And it's all about being in unity as believers and just celebrating who God is and what He's done for us. And